Willkommen, heute ist der letzte Tag des Meran Wine Festival Digital. Wir haben Dienstag, den 10. November. Und zu den letzten Thematiken, die wir im Abschluss bringen, immer noch diese Zusammenarbeit mit Ives und Donor One im Rahmen von Wine Innovation. Wir haben mit uns Edouard Pelonnier, Magimel von der Unité de Recherche Œnologique in RAE, Université de Bordeaux aus Bordeaux, France. Auch wiederum ein sehr interessantes Thema. Welcome to the last day of the Meran Wine Festival Digital. It's Tuesday, the 10th of November, and we have with us Edouard Pelonnier, Magimel, Unité de Recherche Œnologique in RAE, Université de Bordeaux, di Bordeaux. I wish you really a good presentation. Benvenuti all'ultima giornata del Merano Wine Festival Digital. Siamo martedì 10 novembre e proprio tra le ultime presentazioni abbiamo una presentazione sempre in collaborazione con Ives e Donor One. Oggi abbiamo Edouard Pelonnier Magimel insieme con noi dell'Unité de Recherche Œnologique in RAE, Université de Bordeaux, di Bordeaux in Francia. Il tema che lui tratterà sarà Sensory Characterization of Bordeaux red wines produced without added sulfites. Caratterizzazione sensoriale dei vini rossi bordolesi prodotti senza solfiti aggiunti. Allora, seguite bene quest'ultima presentazione e con questo noi abbiamo fatto 5 presentazioni grazie a Ives e Donor One.
Hello, I'm Edouard Pelonnier Magimel and I'm going to present a part of my PhD thesis present in a scientific article in Donor One paper concerning the research of specific sensory space of red wines produced without sulfites addition. This work was performed with the particular involvement of Penelope Mangiru, Dr. Georgia Litra and Dr. Sophie Temper under the direction of Professor Jean-Christophe Barbe. This work was the first approach of my thesis research concerning characterization of red wines produced without added SO2 using chemical and sensory approaches. This thesis was funded by CIVB and is a collaborative work performed in Œnology Research Unit of Bordeaux University under the direction of Professor Jean-Christophe Barbe. All the research scientists and academics of the Wine Quality and Identity team, which gather chemists, biochemists, sensory analysts, and process specialists from our research unit involved in this research. This project is linked to the evolution of French winemaker practice, themselves the result of market and societal expectations. Approach of this work was to link sensory observation with chemical composition of wine. Indeed, from sensory observation, target and non-target compounds were analyzed to understand differences between wines with and without added SO2, with the final objective to characterize specificities of red wines without added SO2. Contextually, SO2 was used since Roman antiquity. It was burned in wine containers used for transport. In 1964, the SO2 was reported for the first time as food preservative. But since the 18th century, it's commonly used in wine industry. Sulfur dioxide was used through the winemaking process. It could be added on harvest, after fermentation, adjusted during aging, and adjusted before bottling. SO2 was used for its three main properties: antioxidasic, antioxidant, and antimicrobial. Lawfully, SO2 was regulated in wine and total SO2 was limited depending on products. In standard dry red wine, the total SO2 is limited at 150 mg per liter. For organic wine, this limit is at 120 mg per liter. Finally, for wine without sulfites, total SO2 was limited at 10 mg per liter. Despite that, recent study revealed that for standard wines, total SO2 quantified was about 70 mg per liter. This revealed that producers have worked to reduce sulfites level in wines. Recent study on consumer expectation reveals that they are willing to pay more organic wine than standard one. The same observation was done for wines without added sulfites. Moreover, a supposed health benefit led to an increase of wine without added sulfites offer. Nevertheless, in parallel, wine experts associate wine without sulfite generally with defect presence. In fact, a study underlines that, during blind testing, if expert testers was informed about the absence of sulfites, they describe the wine with defect descriptors. So, this increased offer of wine without sulfites led us to examine the existence of typicality for Bordeaux red wines without added SO2. As a reminder, typicality requires quality. Typicality consists on the interaction of product specificities which lead to recognize a wine ideotype. Thus, with an exhaustive quantity of wine corresponding to the problematic and without defect, a non-target sensory analysis could highlight sensory specificities of this wine. To answer to this problem, 52 red wines without sulfites, corresponding to the global offer of Bordeaux red wines without sulfites available in southwest France in 2018, were bought. 26 wine for 2015 vintage and 26 wine for 2016 vintage. These 52 wines were described by their producer as without added sulfites wine. In parallel, 20 wines with added sulfites were bought with equivalent geographic origins and equivalent sensory woody characters. Like previously mentioned, the first step to research typicality was the verification of modality correspondence. Indeed, in this case, the principal modality was the concentration of SO2 in wine, more specifically the concentration of total SO2 in wine without sulfites. Does this wine present a concentration of total SO2 under 10 mg per liter? Total SO2 was quantified in each wine with the Franz-Paul method. In the 20 wine with sulfites, the mean concentration of total SO2 was 70 mg per liter. This corresponds to the value mentioned previously, largely under legal concentration. For the 52 red wines without sulfites, 43 present a concentration of total SO2 under 10 mg per liter. 5 present a concentration of total SO2 between 10 and 30 mg per liter. And 5 present a concentration of total SO2 greater than 30 mg per liter. So, on the 52 wines without sulfites, 9 present a concentration of total SO2 greater than the limit laid on. Despite that, it's already known that yeast could produce more than 10 mg per liter during the fermentation. So, all wines with a concentration of total SO2 under 30 mg per liter were analyzed for this work. The 4 wines with total concentration of SO2 greater than 30 mg per liter were eliminated. The second part for typicality research was to verify wine's quality. Thus, a sensory selection of wine was performed. This wine selection was made with blind sensory analysis with 8 expert testers on defect recognition in wine. Wines with and without sulfites were presented to testers in black ISO glasses, and they should define if wine presents a defect or not. In a second time, if one or many defects were detected, they should describe it or them. Testing results were analyzed statistically. Results were consensual between testers. First, for wine with sulfites, for the 2015 vintage, 50% of wine with sulfite were described with at least one defect. This result was commonly observed on these types of tests. For 2016 For the 2016 vintage, all tested wine were described without defects. Concerning wine without sulfites, for the two vintage, 70 to 75% of wines were described with defects. Thus, a defect characterization was further done. Here was present defects described in the 38 wine without sulfites with defects. First, the main defect observed in wine without sulfite was oxidation, with about 50% of wine. Factually, this defect was a consequence of lack of SO2 use, well known for its antioxidant effects. Then, second in terms of frequency were moussy of flavor and volatile phenols, which are produced by spoilage microorganisms and highlighting antimicrobial capacity of SO2. Finally, two other defects were detected by testers, herbaceous and reduction characters. In parallel, price of wine without added sulfite, with and without defect were analyzed and revealed that wine defect was not associated with price differences. Moreover, the most expensive wines in this set was described with defect by testers. A first non-target sensory analysis was made by an experimentation of rearranged tasks with wine described without defect by statistical analysis. This sensory test was performed by 10 testers in black ISO glasses. During testing, testers should form clusters with wine according to their similarities. So, two wines with a same cluster should present similarities. Testers should define a minimum of 2 clusters and put at least 2 wines per clusters. To try to understand how clusters have been formed by testers, at the end of the test, they had to associate each cluster to a few free descriptors. Such an approach was done for time, on one hand by direct olfaction only, and on the other hand by testing in mouth with a global perception, olfactory and mouth feeling, both separately for the two vintage. Here was present result obtained for the global testing of 2015 vintage. As shown, no differentiation was observed between wines with and without sulfites. But a differentiation could be observed between wine on the top and on the bottom of the representation. The analysis of descriptors could explain this observation. In this case, the majority of descriptors were associated with defects. Indeed, descriptors which most influence the representation were oxidation, volatile phenols, and moussy of flavor, the three main descriptors highlighted in the wine selection phase. When a comparison between descriptors and clusters representation was done, that highlighted that clustering was influenced by defect presence. Indeed, wine on the top of cluster representation was described with defect. To sum up this part, it's important to note that same results were observed for all the 4 testing. Indeed, for all testing, defects were described during testing, no cluster was associated with presence or absence of sulfites in wine, and cluster forms were associated with defect presences. This result underline an important point. Such an approach didn't allow to highlight a typicality for Bordeaux red wines without sulfites. With the result of defect perception in wine without sulfites, quality was not present in a majority of wine. Despite that, a specific sensory space of Bordeaux red wines without sulfites could exist, but at this stage, it reveals that statistical selection of wine was not adapted. Indeed, if a specific sensory space exists, it was masked by defect presence in wine present during testing. To solve this problem, a second wine selection was performed, and only wines where any defect were perceived by any expert testers were selected. With this wine, a second sensory experimentation was developed to research specific sensory space of red wines produced without sulfites. With wine without defects and 23 testers, a napping test was effectuated. During napping test, wine were simultaneously submitted to the panelists, each of them in a different randomized testing order. All the panelists test all the wine and place their wine glass on a A1 paper tablecloth according to their own criteria. The instructions given to them were to evaluate the similarities or dissimilarities between wines. They had to position all wine on the paper tablecloth, whereby two wines being positioned close to each other means they were similar, while two wines positioned far from each other indicate their difference according to the perception. At the end of the test, they should describe with one or two free descriptors each wine or cluster of wine. As for the previous approach, such a testing was performed 4 times for the two vintage, both olfactory testing and mouth testing. Here were presented results for olfactory testing for wine from 2015 vintage. On the representation, we could observe that wine with and without sulfites were not differentiated by testers. But this representation highlights only 30% of variability, so another analysis was made with clustering. On this hierarchical clustering in 2 dimensions, it was possible to observe that testers could differentiate wine with and without sulfites. Indeed, on the right was found wines without added sulfites, and on the left, wine with added sulfites. This observation was the same after mouth testing. For 2016 vintage, this separation between wine with and without sulfite was not perceived with olfactory testing, but with mouth testing it's possible to observe two clusters of wine without sulfites, one on the right and the other on the left of the representation. Regarding geographic origin of wine, we could observe that wine on the left of the representation were produced on the right bank of Garonne, and wines on the right of the representation were produced on the left of Garonne. This reveals that geographic origin have a higher influence on the clustering than absence or presence of sulfites. When we go back on the results of 2015 vintage, we could observe that wines presented during the testing came from only of the right bank of Garonne due to selection testing. As regard to napping results, the first important point considered of the absence of defect description during testing. This confirms the choice of wine selection with more restrictions than statistical selection. Finally, this testing reveals that the already known typicality due to geographic origin of Bordeaux wines influence more the testing than presence or absence of SO2. But without this additive variable, tester could differentiate wine with and without sulfites. So, a specific sensory space of wine without sulfites and without defect seem exist, but there is an important presence of defect in wine without sulfites. Moreover, this sensory space was less perceived than geographic typicality and seen more present in mouth than olfactory, like demonstrated by the 2016 vintage. Despite that, napping test was not really adapted for wine description. More precisely, free descriptors chosen by tester was not accurate enough to get a great description of the sensory space detected among wines. Finally, a second sensory approach was necessary to define wine descriptors impacted by sulfites presence without the impact of geographic origin. This approach was effectuated by using method of sensory profile and permit to observe sensory variation due to sulfites. Results of the sensory profile were present in a scientific article in an O1 paper. Thank you for your attention.